All right, good evening, everyone. I think we should make a start. Excellent. They know I always make them stand up to pray when we start. So can we please be upstanding for a prayer to begin? In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. We thank you, our Lord, for the blessing of being able to gather once again. We thank you for the blessing of each other's company and the chance to have wonderful conversations. We thank you for the blessing of Margot being with us tonight. May you give her strength, may you give her wisdom, may you fill her heart with peace and joy in all that she does. And be our guide tonight, Lord, by your Holy Spirit, and help us to learn and to grow in our understanding and knowledge of one another and of you. Through the intercessions of Saint Mary and all your saints and angels, hear us as we pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, power and glory for ever and ever. Amen. Alrighty, well, welcome back, everyone. It's nice to be going again. Today we are very blessed to be given a kick-start in our resurrection, I suppose, what it is, of the meeting, with Professor Margaret Somerville, who is not a stranger to this meeting. She has been with us before and given us a really good talk. By way of introduction, we would be here for the rest of the night if I were to list all of her achievements and positions and attainments and publications and so on. There was one that I saw on her Wikipedia page, though, that I feel I need to mention and maybe ask if we can get some clarification. In 2020, Pope Francis named you a Dame of the Order of St. Gregory the Great for contributions to bioethics. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that before you start on your topic as well. We're very, very fortunate to have her with us tonight and very grateful that she would come out on a cold and windy, rainy night like this to be with us. And she's going to talk to us today about, basically how we can reduce conflict with people we disagree with. I hope that summarizes it all right. So welcome to Margot. Would you like this in the stand? Or do you want to hold it in your hand? Right. There we go.
See if that'll go there. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and it's nice to see you. I found this really difficult to know what to talk to you about tonight. There are so many things going on at the moment that anything that you say feels like such a tiny, tiny contribution, particularly if you're talking about how can we reduce conflict, because our world is in a historically conflictual stage, and it's very worrying. I mean, a lot of people are very concerned about it. So this is what I did. In fact, having to give this talk tonight made me realize this. I realized that a lot of the principles that I follow, I'd never put them all together before. Like, I'm a bioethicist, and that means I work in real-life problems and real-life dilemmas and mainly I'm in medicine, but I get other things too. I got called, because I was living in Canada for 41 years, and when the Enron and WorldCom, or what, I can't remember the guy's other name, they were found guilty of fraud. And they invited me down to New York to give a talk to the senior people from both of these huge companies. And I've never seen such a defensive audience in my whole life. They said these men, and they were almost all in three-piece striped suits. They were all kind of grey. They had their arms folded like this, and they had their legs twisted around each other, and they really didn't want to hear about ethics. And I sort of, that started me thinking about how can we get people who don't want to know about ethics to think about ethics, and what would be the most important thing we could do. And I think it would be to reduce the conflict about what is ethical and what is unethical, and then in the hope of doing that we might be able to reduce or learn some ways to reduce conflict in the world in general. And so putting together this list of things for tonight, I put down the approaches I've taken in trying to deal with difficult ethical situations, to get people, first of all, to think about ethics, and secondly, if at all possible, to come to some agreement, because I think that's what we're lacking. And so I called it a shopping list, and the items that I've got on this shopping list are ideas that I've had over the last 50 years. I started working in this area in 1975, and we're now 25, so that's 50 years. And I got a bit of a shock when I realized it was that long, actually. And what I think has happened, the traditional values have been abandoned, and there are so-called progressive values. I object to that word progressive, but I'm prepared to use it because I want to reduce conflict. And if you say you can't call yourself a progressive, you definitely are not reducing conflict. And it's this whole thing that, we see the politicians on the television saying, I just saw Susan Ley, the new head of the Liberal Party, we've got to meet Australians where they are. Well, most Australians don't know where they are, except, physically they know they're here in Australia. They've got no idea in a lot of cases. They don't think about values. They don't even necessarily know what values they would give priority to if they were in conflict with some other values. So what I'm going to do very briefly, because we could spend a whole lecture on any one of these propositions, is some of them are not new, others are. Some are about process, others are about substance, others are new or different insights, and some might seem lightweight, trivial, or too obvious. And I've got this in bigger letters. These are often the most important, but we don't notice them because we've become so used to them. And this all started with me asking myself some questions, in particular the first one. Why have people with traditional or conservative values, I use those two terms interchangeably, become so spectacularly unsuccessful in persuading people not to abandon these values? And the most obvious of that at the moment, because I lived in Canada for 41 years, I'm very involved in the euthanasia debate in Canada. And there's just been an article in the New Atlantic that where they look at what has happened with euthanasia in Canada. And the summary of the article was, it is out of control. Since euthanasia was legalized on the 16th of July 2016, there have been over 60,000 people given lethal injections by doctors or nurse practitioners. Canada allows nurse practitioners to give euthanasia. And it's really terrible. But why, I told them this would happen. In fact, in this article in the New Atlantic, I get quoted from some evidence I gave to a parliamentary committee in 2013. And I told them that from what I could see it happened in other countries, I thought that there would be at least 7,000 euthanasia cases a year in Canada. And everybody went ballistic who was pro-euthanasia and said, oh no, you're exaggerating, you're creating arguments that's going to frighten people and that. And in fact, in 2023, the yearly total, it goes up by about 30% every year. The yearly total was 15,435 in 1 year. So, and then what are the consequences of that? What does that mean? And well, euthanasia is one of the things it's meant, abortion on demand, same-sex marriage, radical changes in what configuration of people constitutes a family. I just saw an article, I'm just trying to think which country, I think it might be Quebec, that they've decided that they're going to have birth certificates that have got space for multiple parents, because there's new configuration of families, and you can't just have a mother and a father. You've got to have, these are the parental people. So it can be, the biological mother. You could have things like the woman who donated the ovum because it's her biological child, the woman who carried the baby as a surrogate mother, what's called the commissioning mother, that's the woman who's going to have the baby grow up with her, the commissioning father, that's and they might be either his sperm or some other donor's sperm, so you could have the sperm donor if you've got another one. And then in a New York Times cartoon, it had a line of all these people with the names under them. And then so that was 5 people. Then the 6th person was a lawyer to organize the whole thing. Actually, it's no joke that it's coming up for a vote in the New South Wales Parliament about repealing the law that says you can't have you can't have paid surrogate motherhood. So that's a live issue here in New South Wales. And then the final person, the 8th person, was a psychiatrist to sort out everybody. So why have young people particularly rejected conservative values and adopted liberal ones, this progressive values, what they call it? And there's some very interesting work by a social psychologist called Jonathan Haidt at Harvard, and he shows that the base on which conservative people choose their values and form them is much broader than the one on which progressive people choose. Progressives tend to be, well, they are utilitarian, and they rely simply on reason and cognitive mentation. And conservatives have a wider base that includes loyalty and bonding to other people and being concerned about the common good. And then, what are we losing by rejecting the conservative values, and what might be gained by reaffirming some of them? And what I've argued is that we need to look back and find the ones that we still need, and then we have to polish, if we believe that the society really does need these, we have to polish them off and bring them forward and accommodate them with the liberal values. And I think not everything can be accommodated, but I think there's a lot more opportunity for that than the opportunities that we're taking. So what do we do? Well, I don't think we should abandon the belief that some things are inherently wrong. And for example, I believe that giving somebody a lethal injection with the goal of killing them, I believe that is inherently wrong. And I'm not going to say, well, sometimes it can be okay. And a major divide between people who are progressive and those who are traditional is that progressives they're what called in philosophy situational or utilitarian ethicists. What they don't believe anything is inherently wrong. Rather, it all depends on all the circumstances. So therefore, they could come to a conclusion that you could justify, and in fact they do, by saying that euthanasia is not wrong when the goal of it is to relieve very severe suffering. Although what is happening now is that they're using euthanasia. For example, they gave it to one man in Canada. He got permission for euthanasia and he was homeless. And a journalist went out to interview him and said, "Why do you want to die?" And he said, "Oh, I don't want to die." He said, "But I don't want to be homeless more than I don't want to die. I'd rather be dead than homeless." And that sort of thing is happening. And what I think we all have to do as well is avoid the disagreement about whether or not it's inherently wrong. Don't go there. Don't argue that. So if we're not going to argue that and we think euthanasia is inherently wrong, what are we going to do about it? Well, what I've suggested, these are the things I think we can do. First of all, and this is one of those things that seems so obvious that you'd think, of course everybody knows this. It's what a wonderful Indian jurisprudence professor called Upendra Bakshi calls the aha principle, that you have a new insight and you tell all the people about it and you're really excited about it and they go, yawn, like what's new? There's nothing new about that. And this idea that starting from agreement matters is one where people say, well, that seems so kind of obvious and ordinary, but it is extremely important because what it does, starting from that agreement, means that you have an experience of belonging to the same moral universe, so that when you come to disagreements, which you will, those disagreements have a different tone because you remember that you did agree on something. And I think this is extraordinarily important. And sometimes there are surprising agreements. So for instance, if you wanted to start from agreement on euthanasia, where you can start is to say, we all want to reduce suffering. None of us wants another person to suffer. So we all agree on that. Where we disagree is what are the legitimate ways of dealing with that suffering. If you're anti-euthanasia, you say killing a person is not acceptable. If you're pro-euthanasia, you say, okay, you can, providing there's suffering, you can give a lethal injection. And there is, when I said there's some surprising consensus. For example, if you look at abortion, the secular feminists are absolutely adamant that there should be, they don't even think there should be any law on abortion at all. It's completely a free choice for the woman. And if you are somebody who's very strongly against abortion, you will disagree with that. But what happened in the European Parliament was that the European Parliament was going to repeal a law. No, sorry, that's wrong. They were going to have a law that would allow commercial surrogate motherhood. And the secular feminists really disagreed with it because it was to do, they were right, it to demean women. And the traditionalist conservatives disagree with surrogate mother too, because it's contrary to the dignity of the human being, it's contrary to the rights of the child, etc., not to be manufactured for somebody else. And so what happened was that the secular feminists and the traditional pro-life people got together and persuaded the European Parliament to oppose commercial surrogate motherhood. Now you see, that was unexpected, and if you hadn't looked for that agreement, you wouldn't have found it. Now this is a little bit too technical, but I just want to alert you to it. We usually don't look to see where our arguments start, but they all have a basic presumption, all of them. And we've got to work out what our basic presumption is. And what happens is that the different basic presumptions can come to different conclusions on what is ethical or not ethical. So there are 4 basic presumptions in any situation when you're talking about values. You can say, yes, there's no problem here. We're not going to do anything about it. We're just going to let it go. Like abortion, for example. That would be the strong feminist position. Then the second one is, yes, we allow this, but we think there are some circumstances where it shouldn't occur. It would be wrong. So that is yes, but not if. And then third one is, no, you can't do this, except we will allow some exceptions. So that is no unless whatever the exception is. And then finally, there's no. Can't do it, no exceptions. Now, what happens is that if, usually the yes and the no are very clear. And usually there's a lot of consensus around those values that yes, you can do this, no, you can't. But where we get a difference is the yes, but not if, or no, unless. Now, what happens then is if you're equally unsure about whether the exception applies, under the yes, but not if, the general rule will apply, which is yes. But exactly the same facts, circumstances, you're equally uncertain whether the exception applies, then the basic rule is the general rule applies, and that is no, you can't do it. So it makes a difference. So your choice of basic presumption can alter the decision outcome about the value. Now, I also put there the choice of words matters. And I gave you 2 examples. One example used by a doctor published in the New England Journal of Medicine was, euthanasia is a merciful act of clinical care. And there's a huge row going on at the moment whether euthanasia should be defined as part of palliative care. And most of the palliative care people say no, they don't want to have anything to do with it. They think it's contradictory to palliative care. But that is a big issue. And you can compare that with, you are describing exactly the same situation, and it's doctors killing their patients. And I've got into terrible trouble for saying, because that's what I say, well, I just say we can't have doctors killing their patients. And a colleague of mine who's a doctor, a wonderful doctor in Montreal, And I wrote a paper called Euthanasia is Not Medical Treatment. That's the other thing that's done. It is brought in as just another example of good medical treatment. Anyway, Dr. Don Boudreau and I wrote an article that was published in the British Medical Journal that said it's not medical treatment. And seeing it's not medical treatment, there should be a separate group of people who are trained to carry out and know how to do it and don't mess it up. If the society wants it, do it properly. And a lot of doctors have been upset about this becoming part of medicine. And then we went on to say, well, you know, we're going to have to train this special group of people. So what we took was the British Executioner's Bible, which was when capital punishment was still legal in England, and this was the training document for the British executioners. Well, you can imagine the fuss that caused. So anyway, that's another thing you've got to watch out for. You need good facts for good ethics. And as the facts change, so can the ethics. And Father Antonius and I were speaking earlier about transgenderism and what's happening there. And this is where, you know, you've got a little girl and she wants to be a boy, so they take off her breasts and try to fashion an artificial penis for her. And, you know, and you've got the opposite. You've got a boy who wants to be a girl, and they do genital surgery and that on him. Now, what has happened with transgenesis, you've probably seen this in the newspapers, is that it turned out that much of the so-called scientific evidence that justified this, and that the young people would commit suicide if they weren't allowed to have the cross-sex hormones, like you give female hormones to the little boy who wants to be a girl, and that blocks puberty. And then the trouble is it's not reversible, and originally it was argued it was reversible. Anyway, what has happened now is that a lot of governments around the world, looking at the proper facts, have said this is horrific, we can't allow this, and they're banning operating on anybody under the age of 18, if 18 is the age of majority. When they're adults, then autonomy rules they can do if that's what they wanted to do to their bodies. And again, one of the other things that happens here is that when you get an ethical issue, particularly in a hospital, most hospitals are frightened of conflict. And they very often send the issue off to the public relations department. And then the public relations department are experts in spin doctoring something that's wrong. And so you started out with one ethical issue and you end up with about 10. So I try to teach my medical students not to do that. And then there's also an issue with false certainty, that you are certain, but you are wrong. And what happens as well is that most of us are uncomfortable with uncertainty, particularly if it involves our work or our profession, and we don't, and particularly in medicine, or law, or any of the, or maybe even, you know, in the trades, that you're really not sure what to do about unblocking this toilet, but you try something and you say, well, I'm certain this is going to work, but it won't work and you haven't got it right. And so one of the things we've got to learn to do is to have the courage to say, I don't know, because it is far more ethical and far safer to say, I don't know. Now, the people who are most dangerously the worst in this regard, can anybody guess who they are? Sorry, I can't hear, got to talk up.
People who don't agree with me.
I'm sorry, I'm going deaf.
I'll say, I think, well, actually I'll answer seriously. I think it's the progressives, right? I think, like you're asking
Who never says they don't know?
Oh, yeah, the progressive.
Yeah, and politicians. Yeah, politicians, because they feel it's a sign of weakness, and that therefore if they're not strong, they're not going to get voted for. And so I think the three things that are going to be important in the future are dealing with, this is for ethics, dealing with complexity. Our ethical scene is becoming very, very complex, and it's not, it isn't deliberately created. It's particularly with the new science. I mean, the number one issue that everybody wants to talk about at the moment is, what are we going to do about artificial intelligence? And there's just been a huge book published on the use of artificial intelligence in doing neurosurgery. And two colleagues and I wrote quite a big chapter of the book on the ethical issues of using artificial intelligence as the surgeon, because it can inform a robot, and the robot can, be much more accurate, actually, in taking out the tumor than a human would be. And I heard an amazing presentation a couple of months ago where they're using drones now to find people lost in the bush, or to work out whether something that the lifesaver can see from the beach out in the sea, is it a person drowning, or is it a shark, or what is it? And then they tested this out, and they had the group of lifesavers look at through their binoculars and things, and then tell them what they thought it was. And they had a drone do the same thing. The drone was 92% accurate. The lifesavers were 20% accurate. So, these are going to be huge, and we've got huge problems in universities. What do you do when the student has asked the artificial intelligence, to write his paper? How do you know? Now they're trying to modify all the machines so you can put the paper into a Turnitin machine, and that will scan it and see what might be artificial intelligence. So complexity, the more we know, the more we don't know, uncertainty, and potentiality. How do we predict what, if we do this, what good or harm? What is its potential to do good or harm? So, trust, very important, very important. Now, interestingly, there are high levels of trust in scientists, which is a good thing when you think that, a lot of our new ethical problems will relate to new science. And but what is important is that the nature of trust has changed. You often hear people say there's a lot less trust in our society than there used to be. People were much more trustworthy. Well, I'm not sure about that. Maybe that was true. But what has happened, we've changed from blind trust, which says, trust me because I've got status, authority, and power. So we trusted the Prime Minister, we trusted the judges, we trusted the police, we trusted on the whole the military, that they were serving the country and they weren't doing bad things. Now, with people having access to the internet particularly, and with a much more educated population, people decided they weren't going to trust these guys anymore, and also if they got to know about bad things that these people had done. So now we have what's called earned trust. And earned trust says, trust me because I will earn your trust. I will show that you can trust me. So what that comes to is that a lot of ethical practices, for example, transparency, integrity, honesty, compassion, empathy, features of both conservative and progressive values, and they are opportunities for us to agree to say, yes, you know, I might be a progressive values person or I might be a conservative values person, but we can all agree that those things are needed for earned trust. And when you look for them and you all agree that they're present or, sadly, they're absent, you are then experiencing an opportunity for consensus, which again can help us. We have to use all our human ways of knowing in doing ethics. Now, Father Antonius's wonderful invitation said, "Come with thoughtful minds and open hearts." And I said, yes, that's what we need. And so I humbly added to that I think we also need open hearts and thoughtful minds. We need all of that. And more what the science is showing us, that we think that we have logically decided what, for example, what our values are. But the new science is showing that, in fact, we don't think them. We come to them in all sorts of other ways. Intuition, examined emotions. Why did I feel that way? What does that tell me about is good or not good here? Common sense. A wonderful American physician ethicist called Dr. Leon Kass talks about the wisdom of repugnance. If you hear something, and we call it the ethical yuck factor, and you go, yuck, who would do that, you know? Then listen to that and ask, why do I feel that way? I just published a paper, actually it's probably about 18 months ago now, called Does It Matter How We Die? Now, what is happening currently is that people who are euthanized, for example in Canada, if they've given consent before the euthanasia to having their organs taken for transplantation, what they do is kill the person, and then they certify them dead, and then they put on the sort of mechanics and drugs and that are needed to keep the organs viable. So the organs are viable, but the person is dead, and then they take the organs. And that's, you know, the organs are not in perfect shape because, first of all, the body has died, and secondly, they've given them all these things to keep the organs viable. So what I suggested, and I got prohibited from saying this to the students at one point. They said they will too much upset the students. They're going to be doctors. They better learn to get upset, quite frankly. Anyway, what I suggested was, instead of donation of organs after euthanasia, which several countries, the Netherlands, Belgium's doing it, Canada's doing it, why not do euthanasia by removal of vital organs? So what you would do is give the person a general anaesthetic, then you would open them up and you take their heart and their liver and whatever else you wanted. Well, everybody, including the pro-euthanasia people, went absolutely ballistic and said, you know, you can't do that. And so I said, well, why not? You know, it seems a really good idea to me. Anyway, it's caused a lot of fuss. I actually got a prize for the paper by the Catholic Journalists of North America as the best scholarly article of the year 2020. So I was pretty pleased about that. But so anyway, that's that. Now, we've got to face reality. This is the sort of society we live in. Think about it. Every one of those things. It's postmodern, democratic, Western, multicultural, multi-religious, and we do not agree on what our shared values should be, especially regarding the value of upholding respect for human life. And this is a really important point. the value of respect for human life has to be upheld at both the individual level. Every individual's life has to be respected, and it has to be a societal value, that our society respects life. Now, all of that diversity of our society generates uncertainty, which we've just talked about, and fear, because uncertainty often stimulates fear. And that brings us to moral humility, which is essential to finding ethics for our kind of society. And here's what moral humility requires. We have to accept we're all morally fallible. Doesn't mean we're always wrong, but we have to question ourselves about our values if we want other people to question themselves about their values. We need to listen open-mindedly, carefully, and respectfully to the arguments of those who disagree with us, and try to understand those arguments, because if you don't understand them, you can't deal with them effectively. And then we have to, I believe, we have to look beyond considering only ourselves and consider others and the larger picture. And this is called self-transcendence. I'm not the only person in the world. There are other people who are equally as important as I am. And we know that humans are, on the whole, hermits aside, humans are social animals. They need other humans in order to be flourishing human beings themselves. And they did a survey, one of the values firms did a survey in the US, and the single most noted thing that people said they wanted and they felt they didn't have was that they wanted to feel that they belonged to something larger than themselves, that they were one of a community of belonging. And that need for belonging, that's what transcendence is. And it used to be supplied by religion, but a lot of people don't participate in religion or are not religious today. And so we have to take account of the needs and well-beings of others, and that's called, in general, the common good. And that common good, it must be taken into account when in making decisions about ethics. Now, moral humility has a companion virtue, which is moral courage. And that requires that when we conclude something is unethical, we speak and act accordingly. And that can be very hard for people, and again, particularly politicians. Have you ever noticed that they try to fudge whether they're religious, and if so, what religion they are, and they don't want to have to face that, and they tend, not, if you ask them about abortion, they never come. Well, some of them do, but then they get labelled right wing and sectioned off so that they can't have any influence. So it's a very difficult situation. And sometimes that can cause, for example, I know that some of the businesses who refuse to put gay flags in their windows, they got isolated by the gay community and had business losses. And so there can be real consequences from standing up for what you believe on. Now, this is what I really wanted to. How much time have I got, Antonius? Okay, great. I'll try and go fairly fast through this, okay? What I've decided we've got to do is avoid coming head-on in clashes that I believe this is ethical, the other person says it's unethical, and all you do is fight about it. You're not going to persuade anyone doing that. But I think what we can do is avoid that and start to talk about some of the things that are add-ons that, like starting from agreement is in one respect an add-on. Don't just start where you disagree. Have the add-on of going back, finding where you can agree and start there and move to the disagreement. Now, the add-on that I have been working on, and I got told recently that I'm sounding very flaky these days. Well, it's okay, I don't mind that. But one of them is the wonder equation, and how we view what we discover in science has powerful impact on what we see as being ethical or unethical. It is to do with that science. So that's one thing. Another thing that I've just recently published a paper on is respect for the natural and nature. And likewise, whether we respect the natural will have powerful impact on what we see as ethical or unethical with regard to, for example, euthanasia or abortion or new reproductive technologies or climate change. Now, both add-ons involve acquiring experiential knowledge, that you go into a situation to experience something that makes you think further or sometimes differently. Now, one of these is how we view what we discover in science. Now, many progressive values adherents, and Richard Dawkins is a leading light in this. In his book, The God Delusion, he says that science is the only valid way of knowing, and there is no mystery in what it reveals. And he and the progressives who believe him believe that eventually science will be able to explain everything. Now, I heard recently that he's withdrawn a bit from that, that maybe there might be some other stuff that you could also think about, whatever that might be. Now, others, especially those who are religious or spiritual, see science as revealing knowledge that engenders an awareness of even greater mysteries and a sense of contact with the mystical. And I've tried to describe this latter experience in what I've called the wonder equation. This is where one of my colleagues, a philosopher, told me, you know, Margot, people are starting to think you're flaky. And this got published in a big American journal, which I couldn't believe it. I knew the editor, so I really had a bit of an unfair advantage. And I had served on the editorial. It's a journal called Ethics and Behaviour, so it's an important journal. And I twisted the editor's arm. He said, oh, you know, I don't know, I can publish this. I said, yep, publish it. Anyway, here's what it is. I asked, could the wonder equation help us to be more ethical? And there you can see it's AWA plus brackets S minus brackets C plus N, close brackets, gives rise to ET plus G plus H gives rise to E, which is amazement, wonder, and awe plus healthy skepticism, that is, think and question, skepticism minus cynicism and minus nihilism, can create earned trust, which we've already looked at, and elicit deep gratitude, including for life, and hope, which I believe is the oxygen of the human spirit, which can lead to ethics, a concern to act ethically. So that's the article that's called The Wonder Equation. Could it help us to be more ethical? So amazement, wonder, and awe leads us to see that as the radius of knowledge expands, the circumference of ignorance increases. Now, if you imagine our new science as being like a little laser beam that we put in there and we see the DNA, and then we see something else, and so it opens up this little slice of this great unknown. But it doesn't tell us all. What it does tell us is that the unknown is bigger, not smaller, as a result of what we've learnt in science. Because if your radius of knowledge just goes out that far, that's how much unknown you've got. If your radius of knowledge goes out here, you've got this huge unknown. And the more that we know, the more that we know we don't know. And that should, I believe, engender deep respect for the unknown, which you don't have to be religious to respect that unknown. But for religious people, that is usually God, that God is the great unknown. In a way, that's true, and I'm sure Father Antonius would tell me in another way it's not true. And so, but anyway, let's go with it. It's the idea that there is much, much more that we don't know than we do know. So we are not being morally humble when we say we know everything. We shouldn't pretend to know everything. But it does reject the belief that science will explode everything. Now, this is what my basic proposal. I propose that experience, amazement, wonder, and awe can enrich our lives, whether as individuals, communities, or societies, can help us to find meaning, and what we need in life to have fulfilled lives and human flourishing, we have to have meaning and purpose. And I think amazement, wonder, and awe can help us in that regard. And it can change how we see the world, the decisions we make, especially regarding values and ethics, and how we live our lives. Scientific research is being undertaken on the impact of amazement, wonder, and awe. I didn't realize this when I wrote the article, but when it went out to reviewers, a heap of reviewers sent me all these wonderful articles about the scientific research that's going on, trying to find out how not our brain's part of it, but there's more than that, how we actually make ethical decisions. And the latest research shows that it's not basically primarily reason that we use, although that's what the cognitive people think it is, but it's much, much more complex, and in fact it's extremely complex. And so that is what is going on. And they've done some really interesting research. There's a paper by a woman, I'm just trying to think of her name, Virginia Strum, I think it is. And what they did, they got two groups of people, and they gave one group they told, we want you to go into this very beautiful park, and we want you to look at all the trees and see what is growing under the trees, and what do you think about it, and how do you feel about it. And they had another group, matched group, they sent out into the park. They said, we want you to go for a walk in the park for 15 minutes, and we want you to come back and tell us what you found. And there was just an enormous difference between the guys who got told, go and look for the beauty and the amazement and the wonder and the awe, and the guys who didn't. And they found that the ones who got the instructions had improvement in mental well-being. They had a joyful response. It was just completely different. And so, these things are important, and we need to remind ourselves of them. You'll see just a little later on, I think the Australian Aboriginal people have got an enormous amount to teach us in that regard. They really know how to connect in that way. I just saw the Kimberley film on Channel 2 today, and this Aboriginal man, he was a guide, young man, very, very thoughtful and nice, and he showed this enormous river, the Fitzroy River, and he said, I belong to that river, the river the river owns me. And he went on to say he didn't own the river, that the river owned him. So now we act differently I think where that is extremely important is environment and its ecosystems. If we stand in amazement, wonder and awe before nature, creation, and the natural world, are deeply grateful for them and see ourselves as having obligations to protect them and act accordingly, we can deal with climate change. However, we'll act differently if we see ourselves as entitled to exploit nature and its ecosystem just for our benefit, no matter the consequences for others, especially future generations. Now, there's a paradox here, because the progressive people are more nature climate conscious and protecting that than the conservatives are. And that's an area where conservatives, I could scream at them when, they say there's no such thing as destroying the environment and it's all wrong, and it's just so sad. It's so sad. Now, the feelings elicited by the experience of standing in amazement, wonder and awe before nature, creation, were traditionally expressed through religion and as a collective religious we. But today, not everybody is religious. Now, what is the relation between science and religion? Well, I've really told you already. I see it as casting two different lenses on the same reality. You see it through the science eye and you see it through the religious eye, and they are not incompatible. The progressives think they are incompatible and you've got to choose one or the other, and they choose the science lens. But the thing is that depending on how you see what the science tells you, and that is a matter of discernment and discretion, then it isn't incompatible with religion. And religion or spirituality allows us to experience amazement, wonder and awe regarding this knowledge, and to recognize the more that we know, the more we don't know. And that recognition should elicit a response of respect for the natural and nature as a prime expression of the natural. And respect for the natural might the agreement that we need to foster respect for natural and nature be a link between progressive and conservative values, even though we might disagree about what that respect requires. And could respect for the natural and nature help us also? I think it is another add-on. And what I'm interested in doing now is looking for as many add-ons as we can find that will help us to see that this enormous complexity is truly a miracle. I was at a meeting in Oxford, and actually Richard Dawkins was there. And there were about 30 of us, we were all invited, and we were around an oval table, and there was a very English gentleman chairing the meeting, and he was over here on the side, in the middle of the table, and Richard Dawkins was one end and I was the other end, and he and I got into a battle about this. And the other people who were around the table, in a tennis match, you see everybody going like this. Well, these people all kept going, like this. And with that, Sir Nigel, the chair, who was a proper Englishman and couldn't believe how we were shouting at each other, he said, he said, actually, we really need a break. We all need a tea. And he said, so let's have a break. And people got up and started to walk out, and I stayed sitting at the end of the table. And James Watson, who got the Nobel Prize for finding DNA, was at the meeting, and he's very friendly with Richard Dawkins, and he was urging Richard Dawkins on to beat me up, And as James Watson walked behind my chair, he put his hand on my shoulder like this. He said, you know, Margot, he said, the problem with you is you're full of mystical nonsense. And I said to him, you know what, James? The problem with you and Richard is you're mystically tone deaf. And I think that that's true, and maybe we've got to help the people. I don't want to sound condescending, but, you know, I think that's the problem. They've never had it opened up to them. So, ethical issues raised, just to give you an example, ethical issues raised by respect for the natural. Look at these, how important they are. Have you got, as a child, got a right to have untampered with natural human gametes from one identified man and one identified woman? Because currently they're talking about designing your child. A right not to be a clone. If you've read Kazuo Ishiguro's book, Never Let Me Go, where the rich people, it's a science fiction book, but the rich people all get themselves cloned so that when their heart gives out, they take a heart out of a 24-year-old who's a clone of the other person. A right their own, I think this is wonderful, this is Han Jonas' argument, a right to their own unique ticket in the great genetic lottery of the passing on of human life. No two people, even identical twins, are not absolutely the same genetically. Do they have a right to be gestated in a woman's body and not an artificial uterus, which the Japanese have developed? Should the body only be that of the child's biological mother and not a surrogate? Should uterine transplants to biological men be banned? I once gave a speech where I thought the audience was going to sleep, so I suggested, should we transfer a uterus to a biological man? Now, unknown to me, the medical reporter from one of Canada's national newspapers was in the audience. It was a Sunday afternoon conference, and she went back and wrote a story, ethicist says men can have babies, and it was on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen. And I got to my office at McGill University, and there were all these messages on my voicemail from men saying, I want to have a baby. Can you tell me where I can go? And one of my colleagues said, a woman who'd had several children, said, they must be crazy. So anyway, and here's something that is my passion at the moment. We've got to learn, we are so fortunate to have the Aboriginal wisdom, 60,000 years of culture and collective wisdom, a collective human history, human memory, collective human imagination. And so I want to do more. I try to include something about that in every paper I write now, because when you look into it, you can learn from it. I think we're going to appreciate that much more in the future. You know, when the Commonwealth Parliament here had to decide whether to withdraw the prohibition of euthanasia in the Northern Territory, having a blank on his name, Senator, he's retired now, he's very famous, not Dobson, but it's a name like that. Anyway, he got up and they asked what the Aboriginal population thought about allowing euthanasia. And he said, no, he said, that's white fellas' law, not black fellas' law. We would never do that. And so it was really important. And here's something that I got into big trouble for. I believe we've got to have a secular sacred as well as a religious sacred. I don't want to get rid of the religious sacred. Something sacred means that you treat it in such a way that you don't wantonly destroy it or lay waste to it, but you hold it on trust. And so I was trying to think of a way that we could get people who are not religious to say, like for instance, human life, even though it's not religious sacred for them, it's secular sacred. You don't lay it waste, you hold it on trust. And anyway, this also got into, a lot of my stuff in North America used to get into the press and they'd say, that woman again. And anyway, what happened here was that the religious people were furious with me. They said I was denigrating the sacred and they were not going to have this secular sacred. And the secular people got furious with me because they said I was trying to impose religion on them. And one of my law students at McGill came up to me and said, you know, Prof. Somerville, you're in trouble. He said, everybody's angry with you. And I said, yeah, I know. I said, really pretty awful. And he said, you know, when you've got everybody from both sides mad at you, he said, maybe you're onto something important. So I've lived on that and I hope that that's true. And I think we've got to think of we all now recognize our environment and our physical ecosystem and that we can irreversibly destroy it. We have a metaphysical ecosystem. The values, stories that we share, beliefs, ways that we act, ideas, concepts such as the common good and we can irreversibly destroy that as well. So we have to learn how to hold it on trust. And part of that will be trying to get on with each other. So what do we need to do to go forward? We need hope, we need courage, and we need fellow ethics travelers. There's scientific research, it's computer generated, that shows that what the scientists did, they took a computer screen, they put a huge number of tiny, tiny little dots. They cut it down the middle of the screen and put red dots on one side, yellow dots on the other. Red dots were rats, and rats only decided in favor of themselves. Yellow dots were lemmings, and lemmings decided, they thought about themselves, but they also looked at the common good and what was needed for others. And then they ran 5,000 sequential decision-making. And the rats did what they wanted, and the lemmings tried to do what they hoped for. And initially, the lemmings were down to almost nothing. But what happened was, as long as a little tiny group of lemmings stuck together, suddenly, after the screen going almost all red, little yellow dots started appearing in the red. And what the scientists were able to show was that if those little dots were not bound to it, there were several lemmings forming a little community, then the lemmings would get wiped out. The whole screen went red and could not be reversed. However, if those little lemming groups stuck together, they gradually came back. And that is what I hope is going to happen. I hope we're not at that stage. Anyway, I don't want to leave you with too rosy a picture. So, yeah, doing ethics in practice, which bioethics is, often involves dealing with what's called a world of competing sorrows. There is no harm option. And the awful decision you have to make is, who are you going to harm? And how do you decide who that should be? And I would promote a guiding principle in seeking to act ethically in these situations is to implement a preference in favor of the most vulnerable, most in need persons. Give them the preference. They should be the least harmed. And so I believe our survival as societies, and even possibly, although this might be exaggerated, a species might depend on our doing that. Thank you. I think I might sit down.
Oh, sure. Yeah, would you like to?
Yeah,
have a
can you?
seat here?
I think, can you put it down?
Yeah, I can bring it.
Sorry, sorry, Antoinette.
That is a good idea.
Yeah, that'll do. I think I need to sit down.
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking talk there. I will say, I feel you have made quite a contribution to reducing conflict in the world. At the very least, you've brought all kinds of people who otherwise would be in conflict with each other into agreement against you. And that has increased the net agreement in the world. So that's quite an achievement. We have now an opportunity for questions. We have a microphone just over there, so we'll use the system where if you'd like to ask a question, please come to the microphone. Oh, sorry, you're right? Yeah. So please just come to the microphone and ask. You can line up there if you like, or you can just sit down in the nearby pews and wait until your turn comes along. So please come along. Don't raise a hand. Just come right ahead. Yes. So go ahead. And actually, would you like to just say your name so Margot can put a name to the face?
Thank you very much, Ms. Somerville. My name is Peter, and looking at ethics and values, just looking at the trend in the world, we might have started long before your time when we were talking about religious values, where a lot of people were religious, and then that might have evolved into something a bit more generic, like family values, just like a more of a big umbrella. And then we kind of move into conservative values. For example, looking at evolution, not revolution, that's sort of a conservative idea versus a revolutionary idea. And then now you've got more of the right-wing values, which include things like small government, environmental skepticism. You were talking about even vaccine skepticism. Like, for example, I was voting recently in the federal elections, and I was looking at the website of, what's it called? Family First. Family First, the party. I was looking at their website, and you expect all the family values, but now they've got things like libertarianism. They've got things like vaccine skepticism. So my question to you then is, seeing this clumping and evolution of values kind of put together, what's your view of this? Is this for the better? Is this for the good? This is natural? Have you like noticed that pattern that I'm kind of sort of that's kind of my view of what I'm seeing? What do you think of that concept?
So essentially, how do you choose your values? Is that what you're asking?
It just seems that people are kind of going into teams. Like it started with just everybody's religious, so it's religious values, then family values, then conservative values, and then like I'm on team conservative, I'm on on team liberal, and then I'm on team right wing, I'm on team left wing, and they seem to have more and more values kind of tacked on.
Yeah. One of the problems, you see, in the past, if you belonged to a certain religion, you could be pretty sure that almost everybody else had the same values as you did, because the religion taught you those values as a child. You grew up in a family where they were the ruling values. And today, people haven't got consistent values. I call them values packages. If you imagine that all your values form your values package, it's almost impossible to find someone else who's got exactly the same values package as you have. And where that becomes a problem is that when you go to vote for somebody, You can't find a politician who's got all the same values as you have. So what you have to do is you've got to look at that politician's values. You've got to say, what is my most important value? And you choose a politician for your most important value, even though there might be a whole lot of other values there that you really don't like and you don't want. And it's a very difficult situation. I mean, you know, Winston Churchill said that democracy is not perfect, but it's better than all the other ones. So, and I think we're seeing that at the moment in our world, sadly. But yeah, it's a tricky business. I guess this idea too that you've moral humility, that you don't only think that the other person can be wrong, you also think I could be wrong, and that kind of, I think, leaves you open-minded to consider the other person and to see where they're coming from, and to understand that they're not bad people, you just think they're making a bad choice of values. And very often the bad choice will be because in the current situation, because what are the progressives, their two dominant goals are intense individualism, that's called expressive individualism. So voting for autonomy always trumps protecting the common good. And what I've called presentism. They don't look to collective human memory, and they don't look to collective imagination to see what's going to happen if they do this. You know, there's some people in Canada are absolutely shocked at what has happened with euthanasia. They can't believe it. And the man who was the head of the committee to implement euthanasia has resigned recently because he said he just can't believe what is happening. Now, he was a pro-euthanasia person, you know, who advocated for this. So, and that's where I would see Aboriginal Australians helping us. As they, I wish I could think of the name of that politician. He always wears a hat with an Aboriginal.
Mundane? Mundane? Is it
Warren
Mundane?
Mundine.
Mundane, is it?
I can't, sorry, I can't.
Mundane.
Warren Mundine.
Is it him?
Might be Dodgson, I think, is the
Dodson, yeah, Patrick Dodson.
Dodgson, I
yeah,
think.
that's right. That's who it is. Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's what he said. You know, and the same thing in Canada. I was on an ethics committee with the First Nations chief of Canada, and we'd been set up by the government to look at what was ethical in storing nuclear waste from the was a nuclear waste management board. And everybody had, on the first meeting, everyone went round the table and said who they were, you know, what they did and why they were on this committee. And it came to this very distinguished man, George Erasmus, and he left us silence, and everybody sort of listened. And then he said softly, he said, you know, if it had been up to us, this committee wouldn't exist because we wouldn't need it. He said we never would have allowed nuclear power, and we would have looked back 7 generations and looked forward 7 generations and said, this is not a good ethical idea. So you see, there's an awful lot we can learn.
Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. I have a question about the idea of like respect for the natural and nature as being part of how we make like our ethical decisions and stuff like that, because although I see very easily the way that, like, you know, respecting nature and protecting nature is something that's really important in terms of like the natural environment, I feel like I see a lot of arguments, especially maybe from the conservative side, saying, oh, well, we don't see this phenomenon in nature, therefore we shouldn't be doing it in our societies, in terms of like people will say like, oh, you know, homosexuality is not natural, or I don't know, surrogacy is not natural, or a bunch of other things aren't natural, and that's reason not to do them, as like that's an ethical reason not to do them. But nature also has a lot of things that I think we would all agree are quite like immoral, like murder is part of nature, and the preservation of the vulnerable is definitely not part of nature. So how far do we let nature dictate what's ethical?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's right. But we have to, respecting nature does not mean that we never interfere with nature. Rather, what it means is we have to be able to justify the interference that we make. So, for example, the whole climate change thing, for fish farms, I mean, polluting the harbours and that, we can't, that's interfering with nature, and I don't think we can justify that. So tonight I just gave you the idea that we've got to, it's relevant to think about, first of all, am I interfering with nature? And secondly, if I am, can I justify that interference? And some things are so obvious that you don't even have to think about justifying it. For example, to take out somebody's appendix so that they don't die of peritonitis, thinking of Bindi Irwin, who just had her appendix taken out, that is interfering with nature. But of course, it's totally justified. And you've also got to be careful that people don't misuse the concept of respecting the natural. There's a... no, I won't go into this. But particularly if you're going to put in major things that will affect the natural landscape, for example, and there's a principle that says you should be hesitant, and that you have to, if you're going to do something that could cause serious harm to the environment, then you have to be able to justify what you're going to do before you do it. Well, the Americans didn't like that because they said that's going to stop a lot of things we want to do. So what they said, they wouldn't call it a principle, they would call it, it's called the precautionary principle. And they said, we won't call it a principle. They said, we want to call it an approach, the precautionary approach, because if it's only a precautionary approach, then you can decide you don't like that approach and you want another. But if it's a principle, you've got to take it seriously. So there's a lot of messing around with this stuff, you know. But I need to do a lot more work on the natural. And also what I've found is that the progressives, because they're so adamantly, strictly reason-based cognitive mentation, they don't believe there is any such thing as nature or the natural. They call it the naturalistic fallacy, that it's wrong to think that some things are natural and others aren't. And your point about saying that homosexuality is unnatural, I would never use that term. I wasn't saying that. But I did think about it as being a problem for arguing that you've got to respect the natural. But maybe my response to that would be that maybe some things that we have traditionally labelled as natural, or unnatural rather, that we were wrong in doing that. And certainly, even if you said it was unnatural, I think you would have no justification for interfering or discriminating on that basis.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Margaret, for a beautiful lecture. And I wanted to ask the question that was asked about the nature and
You have to speak up a bit.
respect of nature, respect of natural, but thank you very much for covering that already for me. Remains, however, you mentioned something about facts and their impact on ethics, and if the facts change, then the ethics will change. I find some troubles in understanding why would facts, if they are facts, do change. So can you give us some examples of how can facts change?
I'm not sure I understand your question, sorry.
Sorry, okay. Can Abuna?
If I can summarize, I think what in one of your slides you said that we have to be ready for changing our minds when the facts have changed.
Yeah.
So the question is, surely facts don't change, they're just facts.
Well, that's not true in science. That, you know, we think we know something and we treat it as a fact, but then something else happens that you know that it's not right, it's not a fact. I mean, the example I gave was the transsexual example, where there was supposedly properly done research that showed that if you didn't act on the child's identification as being the opposite sex to what their biological sex was, that the rate of suicide in those children, they called it affirmative therapy, that if the child was a boy but said she was a girl, you had to say, yes, you are a girl, you're right. And they argued that if you did that, the parents did that, then the child was at no greater risk of suicide than any other child. But if you denied it and said, no, you're not a girl, you're a boy, then the rate of suicide was supposed to be quite high among those children. And in actual fact, it turned out that this research was mainly concocted, it couldn't be verified, and other research showed that it was completely wrong. It didn't make any difference to the suicide rate whether or not you affirmed the child's description of their sexuality.
So it's our perception of facts rather than if it is well-known fact. It's a fact that sun rises from the east. This is the level of facts I'm trying to refer to, or 1 + 1 = 2, although some mathematicians now try to say it differently. But this is, I think what I was referring to is what are the examples of ethics changed based on our perception of factual changes?
Again, I'm not sure.
I mean, do you have an example of a case where a fact changed or our understanding of something changed and the ethics changed in a major sort of way?
Yeah.
Due to the change in understanding.
If there are no examples, that's fine.
I suppose the one that you just gave is an example of that. Like that, we had one view of the transgender outcomes, and then that changed, and so. But has the ethics changed? Have people changed what they do now?
Yeah, I think, for example, if you took how women were, well, even today, but sort of 100 years ago, and what was considered facts about women and how they were treated as a result of those facts, and then you look at what we've got today, it's completely different. And the facts have changed.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sam. I really enjoyed your interesting discussion, and it's good to see you've got your own values package. You're taking from the left and the right. But my question is about when you talk about the importance of mysticism and sort of the left progressives being more sort of cognitively based. I'm just wondering, if you've come across that book, The Master and His Emissary by McGilchrist, who talks about the Western society being predominantly left brain and neglecting the right brain function, because the themes that I understand from that seem to resonate with what you're talking about, how the Western world seems to be very, about order and things having precise and having things very structured, whereas the right brain is more sort of holistic, more about experience and appreciation of nature.
Sorry.
Translate.
The whole idea of left brain and right brain thinking, does that have any relationship to the progressive, conservative, sort of rational,
Yeah.
mystical dichotomies? Do you see them mapping onto each other, or are they really different things? You've come across like the whole idea of left brain activity and right brain.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Again, I mean, even that, some of the latest research is that there is a fundamental difference in the way men's brains operate as compared with women's brains, and that it's a very profound difference, and they're doing the research at the moment, and quite a lot of people are very surprised about it. Men's brains tend to have the different hemispheres, and they are clearly separated, whereas women's brains are more holistic. This is some of the new research. And one of the interesting things is that mainly, overwhelmingly, medical research has been carried out on men, not on women. And then they've just assumed that the results of the research apply equally to women. And the reason for that was often that you could never be sure that the woman was not pregnant. And particularly the pharmaceutical companies were worried that if she was pregnant and then gave birth to a baby, hiccups, with a serious abnormalities, that the pharmaceutical company would be sued. So now there's been a movement that it's wrongful discrimination not to have carried out the research on women as well as men, and there's a sensitivity to that. So, yeah, this is the point. I mean, this is all so complex. That's why I said complexity, uncertainty, potentiality. We're in the deep unknown on all of those things. And I think actually the future of ethics is going to be learning how to handle those realities in an ethical way. I mean, and even moral humility, the fact that you say, I accept that I can be morally wrong, that's a radical change, because, we've always thought, no, we're morally right. But accepting that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean you are morally wrong. It just says I'm going to be open-minded. Father Antonius says open-mindedness. And it also means that you've got to think about what are I call them informing principles. What's informing the value judgments that you come to? And it's an enormous amount of stuff. I mean, it can be how you were treated as a baby might be affecting that in some way. I also got into trouble once because I suggested we might have a gene for being religious. And there are some genes that have only got a critical window period where they require an experience to activate the gene. Like this work was it's called epigenetics, and this work was carried out on baby rats. And the baby rats have got a gene for being a nurturing instinct as an adult rat. But that gene only operates if their mother licks them very shortly after they're born. And if they're not licked, then the gene shuts down and they don't get the nurturing gene activity. So I suggested maybe we have a gene for religion. And I postulated that maybe it had to be activated before puberty, probably by about 8 years of age. And if you didn't activate it, if you didn't have any religion given to you, your parents never took you to church, never told you about any God or saint, or you didn't have to be that. It could be just environment stuff these days, but that child needed that. Anyway, I gave this speech, and I had a man come up to me at the end of it from the audience. He was very distressed, and he said, I'm so upset. He said, he was in his 20s. He said, I had nothing as a child about religion, but now I'm religious, and I'm worried that it's not very good because I haven't got the gene. So I had to think up an explanation of how you could be okay, but you didn't have what was necessary. I decided to drop that one.
Thanks very much for the talk. I've probably got about a question per slide. But my main question, or what I'm mostly curious about, is actually more about how the conversation happens. Like you've mentioned a lot of forums, like the forum you went to at Oxford with the 30 people. The forum you went to at Oxford with the 30 people, right? So the question is about the ethical conversation, like in society, where does that happen, right? And you've talked about like the forum, you've talked about like the Atlantic, medical journals, which not everyone reads. I'm just curious if you've got any sort of thoughts to share on where the conversation happens and how these decisions actually get made and how groups of people actually decide what their values are, because it's not a very transparent process.
Yeah, well, in our society, we do it more or less through Parliament and through authorities. In a way, when the police go and arrest somebody, that's a statement of values, that we think that person has broken some societal value that merits something as drastic as losing their liberty and being charged with something. And so it's all tiny, it's like a mosaic, and every tiny little tile makes a difference. And I sometimes, I think we need metaphors in looking for ethics, and sometimes I imagine it as like a giant jigsaw puzzle, that we get little pieces, or we feel something, we hear something, maybe we say some prayers, and that makes us think about something we haven't thought about before. And those little pieces all end up together. Whether or not they make a consistent pattern is a problem. Whether or not we think they're absolutes or that we would allow exceptions to them. I mean, one of the ones that I have trouble with is that, I am very against shortening human life. I am totally for absolutely fully adequate pain management and symptom management for people. In fact, I would jail doctors or nurses who don't provide that. And yet I don't want people being given lethal injections and killed. And partly that is because that becomes a societal value, that it's okay to do that when you've got 60,000 dead people because doctors gave them a lethal injection, and the Parliament and the courts allowed that. The courts held that it was unconstitutional not to allow euthanasia, and the Parliament then passed laws saying, okay, you can have euthanasia. And it's a very, very difficult situation. And where I hesitated, the example given to me was, and sadly this is true at the moment in our world, that you've got a soldier who's been desperately, badly wounded, and will not survive, and there's nothing that you can do to help him, and yet you have to retreat, or else more of the soldiers will be killed. I mean, I think of Ukraine when I say this. Would it be acceptable to give that soldier a lethal injection so he doesn't lie there dying while the opposing force comes through? And I find that the most difficult situation, to know what to say to that. I mean, it's really, and look at Gaza, what's happening in Gaza. It's just terrible what's happening in our world. I'm worried. I'm really worried about it. I think we sometimes don't realise how awful it is.
Thank you.
While anyone else is thinking of a question they'd like to ask, may I ask a question? You had that lovely slide about earned trust. That trust has to be earned nowadays. And you gave a list of the things that lead to trust being earned, transparency and competency and things like that. What do you make of the phenomenon of Donald Trump? That Donald Trump, the sort of the populist leaders who are all over the world, not transparent, not terribly competent, not compassionate, none of those things, and yet people trust them and vote them in. I'm just wondering, what do you make of that phenomenon?
I don't think they do trust him. I think the reports are that Donald Trump's got the lowest popularity that he's ever had. And frankly, I look at the people who voted for him, and I look at how excited they were, and how, you see, they experienced the lead up to that election, I believe, as a bonding experience. That there they were all together, they all had the same hats on, they were all cheering for the same thing, they were all considered themselves patriots. I mean, they had this nice word that's an honourable word. You're doing a good thing, you're for the nation, you're for America, God bless America. And I think, in fact, there are reports on this now that a lot of those people are horrified by some of the things that Donald Trump's done. Donald Trump is, this is not my original thought, he's completely transactional. He does deals, and he thinks he can deal the world out of trouble, and he will get the fame for it, and he will be praised for it. And in a funny way, it's a sort of an immortality wish, that he'll leave a legacy that everybody will always remember.
Right, are there any more questions before we wrap up? Yes, please, go ahead.
I think we better make this the last one.
We'll make this the last one. Lovely, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. My name's Tiana. I just had a question back on the topic of respect for the natural. If I was to generalize, I guess the people, more progressives on the left, that are quite concerned about climate change and, are quite the radical environmentalists, more often than not, they also, fall into the category of people who are, pro-abortion, perhaps pro-euthanasia. I guess my question to you is, why do you think, firstly, they're so passionate about the natural in that sense, and why hasn't that translated, I guess, to respect for human life as opposed to the natural world?
That's a very good question. I've looked at that, and all the things you said, like abortion and euthanasia and privacy and confidentiality. Well, most people, both sides, privacy and confidentiality, they agree on. But with climate change, the progressives are much more concerned for the common good. It's what's called pro-social, and the Conservatives, on the whole, I think are not nearly enough concerned. And so there's a switch over there. And I think with the Conservatives, it's because they actually think the scientific evidence is wrong, that humans are not causing climate change, and that there's nothing that we can do to prevent it. And of course, you know, open-minded, there's a possibility that they could be right. But, you know, if we feel that we're going to be destroyed and our world is going to be destroyed by this, and if you just look at the weather things that are happening in Australia, then, and you feel there's nothing you can do to stop it, that's a very threatening and depressing situation. And humans need joyfulness. They can't live in, you know, solid depression. And but the conservatives, I think, some of them, not all of them, but are dealing with it by denying what the science tells them. And also, there's all this research going back and taking cores out of the earth and dating them, and then looking at what they tell you about the climate, let's say, you know, 1 million years ago or something. They've just taken one out in Antarctica that they're doing that with. And so, you know, it's a difficult situation. And also, I think, well, we've got to worry about children, you know, that children are very impressionable. And if it's all dark and gloomy and terrible and, you know, the world's not going to be here for you, at least the progressives are positive that we can do something about it. And I think maybe we should go with that, even if we think they're wrong. That, you know, sometimes you've got to choose the least bad option, even though it's not what you would prefer.
Thank you.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Margot. Can we please show our appreciation for a fascinating evening? Thank you. So we're really glad, as I said, to be up and running again with the Aletheia meetings. Our next meeting will probably be in July, and we have locked in a lady called Liz Stone, who is the current, I think she's the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in Australia. So she'll be coming to talk to us about the future of ecumenism. What hope do we have? What has been achieved in the last 100 years of churches talking to each other, denominations talking to each other? What can we expect to happen in the coming years? And we don't have a date yet, but keep your eye out on your usual social media announcement outlets. And on the Indigenous matter of Indigenous spirituality, in August, we're still working on this, but we're hoping to have a panel of an Orthodox theologian and an Aboriginal elder to talk about the intersections between Orthodox Christian spirituality and Australian Indigenous spirituality, which I'm really looking forward to as well. Again, more information to come. If you would like to help out with the organisation of Aletheia, please do let me know. We need fresh blood because some of our old helpers are, well, getting old and moving on in life. So if you are willing, please do let me know. We'll be really happy to have any applications for that. And if you like eating delicious snacks and having wonderful conversations, we will provide the snacks on the table at the back of the church. You have to provide your own conversation. So feel free to hang around for a little bit and do that. Thank you all for coming, and may we finish with a prayer, if we could all please stand up. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy